and thinking about what most individuals that involved in any type of training, endurance, barbell, whatever it may be, they struggle with, and especially young coaches, personal trainers, again, people just evaluating, like you and me, evaluating our programming. What are the things that undergird good programs? Like, how do we know what to do? And again, students and young coaches ask me, I'm good at all these things. I struggle with programming. How do I do it? My advice is always to pick up a program that already exists, purchase it, right? When appropriate, if it's for sale, purchase it, don't steal it. But purchase it, and then as you're working through it with your team, with yourself, whatever the circumstances are, start to make notes what's working and what isn't. I'm noticing I'm picking up fatigue here. So a program written for a 25-year-old may not work for a 45-year-old, for example. Why? What are the things? What is undergirding good program writing? And I'm going to do just a little video here on training theory, and I'm going to rehash an article. I'm not going to rehash the exact. It's not a review per se. I'm going to expand this video to see what it would actually look like. When you apply these training theories, this good training theory, and the two that I'm going to talk about are the supercompensation model, or the GAS, General Adaptation Syndrome, from ahjsT, and the fitness fatigue model that it was eloquently described in an article by Chiu and Barnes, which I did a Journal Club review on 2003. Now, the Chiu and Barnes article is public domain, so I'm going to show it here. It shouldn't violate any copyrights because it is public domain. You can download it. I encourage you to do so and read it. It's a good article, but I'm going to use the pictures to help kind of demonstrate my point. And hopefully you can see how programming might look at a weekly level, or daily level, weekly level, and then over the course of a meso, and then maybe even longer. Okay, we could talk a lot here. I could talk a lot here about these concepts. I'm going to try to be succinct. I'm going to try to be to the point, and hopefully, you find value and start to think about, reflect on why is it that I don't recover here, or how do I overlay my conditioning with my lifting? Like, how do I piece these things together? And more importantly, again, I would encourage you not to try to write programs from scratch. Take an existing program, purchase it properly. If you're a weightlifter, buy a Catalyst program. If you're, or there's many others. I'm just saying you don't have to buy a Catalyst program. Buy something from Westside for powerlifting. Again, I'm not saying any of these is better than others. I'm just using examples, right? RP for hypertrophy, et cetera, et cetera. But then as you go through the programs, you can start to evaluate what isn't working, and you'll see these training theories at work. You'll start to understand why, again, if you're an athlete that's in more of a strength conditioning focus, where you're trying to gain cardiovascular fitness while you're trying to lift, how do I organize things in such a way that I get the best out of both? And for most people, having that mixed model is appropriate. Some of you may be advanced athletes, and you can't do that as mixed, right? Again, we'll talk about that. All right, let's take a look at the Chiu and Barnes article and just talk about training theory. All right, so let's talk about the article briefly. I want to not get lost in the woods here. ahjsT's General Adaptation Syndrome, stimulus, right? Resistance to the stimulus results in supercompensation. Okay, so you lift 5x5 on one day. Usually 48 to 72 hours is the cycle that you'll see this curve, if we're talking about within a week, okay? And then after, depending on how fit you are and what fiber types, again, I'm going to keep things in general here. I know you can say, well, what about this? Okay, if you're a rower, you might see this a little bit less if we're doing 5x5, right? If you're a power lifter, this could be a little bit longer. If you're a 65-year-old power lifter, this could be even longer, right? So this in general, just stick with me. 48 to 72 hours is a good, as you go through this fatigue curve. Okay, now let me back up for a second. Plus and minus here. This is the stimulus. Okay, it's going to generate an increase in performance or a decrease in performance. All right, early on there's a decrease in performance. Not surprising, anybody's ever done anything, right? You did something hard, and then you come back the next day and try to do some explosive in particular, or even repeat the same exercise. You might find my performance is actually worse. The only people that might not see that are newbies. The only problem with newbies is they tend to get DOMs, right? And DOMs interferes with that. So even if their performance is enhanced, they're going to be so sore it's hard for them to express that new fitness. But let's assume for, in general, 48, 72 hours later, you see an enhancement in performance, in this case 5x5, not to failure, and strength is better within the week. And so you test on a Friday, right? And lo and behold, you're stronger than you were on Monday, all right? That you have this resistance. Now, if you place the stimulus too close together, okay, you can get a couple things that happen. So you do 5x5 training on Monday, and then you do 5x5 training on Wednesday, and now you're down here on Friday. You're like, man, I am tired. Right? I'm not seeing a gain in performance. However, if you deloaded throughout the weekend and maybe Monday and retested on Wednesday and you give it enough time, you find that, oh my goodness, Wednesday, I'm super strong. And so I have this accumulative input, I get a nice output. The problem is that you have to wait for it. okay? And you have to time things a little bit better, okay? You don't know if you're getting stronger. So, when you start to think about theory of setting up a program, it might be better to do that once a week and allow for recovery and see your fitness gains. If you're in Glenn Penley's book, the Penley method, I really like his categorization. Again, these things I thought about, just never saw it written down in a very organized way, is the beginner and intermediate and advanced, not related to how strong they are necessarily, but how they adapt. So a beginner, again, they can turn and burn within maybe Wednesday. They're already stronger because the amount of fatigue they incurred isn't that bad. It's soreness is the only thing they're going to have to deal with. An intermediate athlete might have to wait a whole week in order to see those gains realized because the stimulus is now higher than it was for a beginner. That in turn generates a greater fatigue. Therein means that they have to rest a little bit longer, but they still see performance gains within the week. An advanced athlete, okay, this might be the course of a whole cycle, right? They accrue, enough volume, and the stimulus has to be so high because they're so well adapted. The body is so resistant to change that the stimulus has to be that kind of stimulus that it takes a whole cycle, mesos, to see even just a slight gain in performance. Okay, and so again, you start to see that now in different types of athletes and how you might program during a week. All right, you could program this during over the course of a meso. So, this could be week 1 and 2, and then you have a deload. This is like Texas method, right? The old peaking method. Again, Glenn Penley reference here. And, you see that in Joe Ken's book, right? Displayed as well. And then on that 4th week, you retest, and lo and behold, you're stronger. Okay, that could be built up to a meet perhaps, or whatever it may be. So you have this accumulated volume that causes fatigue. We're not seeing improvements in fitness, and then behold, right, you have this improvement at the end. This could be over the course of a meso. Right. So in general, as you see this, right, and I use a story of me getting sick when I was young, and I was dumb. I'd bench twice a week, heavy. I didn't know what these words meant at the time, but maximal and repetition. I do maximal and repetition, maximal in the first part of the week, repetition on the end, and I just never saw gains. Well, all I was doing is just providing so much frequent stimulus, right, and I was fit enough that the stimulus had to be so high that I just would do this. And then when I'd get sick, I'd have this deload time, and I'd come back and test after a week, and lo and behold, my strength was up. And I couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. Why am I getting stronger from being sick? That doesn't make any sense. Well, I had a chance to rest, okay? And so this is why the timing of your rest and how long you rest between sessions, especially sessions that are heavy or there's some output that you want to see, a jump higher, so on and so forth, has to be well timed, okay? So that's just in general, the general adaptation syndrome, all right? Timing of knowing when fatigue is going to occur and then how to rebound. Now, the complication gets when you start to think about different types of stimulus. If you do 3 sets, if you did 8 snatches at 70% of your max, that's a pretty explosive activity with a lighter weight. That'd be more dynamic type of training if we get down to size principle motor recruitment. I'm going to show you a paper here in a minute. Paper, I mean just a Word document. I threw some stuff on. And then you think about maximal, so you might do 5x5 training. Well, that's more repetitions at a heavier load, right? That's a 5x5, 25 reps, right? That's going to be more challenging workout, more volume associated. If I did 10x10, if I got crazy and did 10x10 German volume style training style type of thing, 1 minute rest, just 100 repetitions of volume with a fairly good load as I go throughout it, right? That is going to generate a lot of potential stimulus for muscle hypertrophy and then therein some strength, but the fatigue is going to be so high, right? It's going to cause some problems, okay, with any other types of training. This is why maybe German volume training is effective. So when you look down here at the fitness fatigue model now, this is where we're starting to take account different types of training and how we might overlap them. Okay, so if I do a 5-mile run and then go lift later, why are my legs tired? Well, like, of course I did the 5-mile run, but what would be a better order? Well, lift first, then fatigue. Why? Because the maximal type of training isn't going to have near the amplitude, right, and duration as the running is. Now, still within the day, you're going to feel that 5x5 training. There's no doubt about it. But if you flip the two, you're going to see that the run will affect the lifting a lot more. All right. Now, the question I always get is, order of training just in general for fitness, it probably doesn't matter that much because the stimuli to see improvement doesn't have to be that high in either one. So in other words, if you're just starting out, if you just keep lifting and doing leg press or, squat or whatever it is, you're still not pushing the stimulus so high yet, you don't need to, that you're seeing high fatigue curves. And so you can do your conditioning later. Same with the conditioning. You're still not so fit that you're going so hard that your legs are so zapped that you can't turn around and have a decent squat session. Now, if you're an athlete, Even if you're not as well trained, now we're talking about optimizing performance. Then we're going to lift first before we do conditioning. And I know, like I've seen this in strength conditioning world, like Division I athletes. Well, these athletes are always strong. We're going to do conditioning first, so they are practicing under fatigue. I'm not a big fan of that. Okay, because the idea is, why don't we just get them stronger? And you're like, well, there's a certain point they need strength. Well, why don't we do something that's more explosive then? Why do they? They're going to learn how to train under fatigue. And this is a philosophical thing. They're going to learn how to train under fatigue by doing their sport. They don't necessarily need to do it in the weight room. But anyway, I'm probably just a weightlifting purist that way. But as you look at these curves, then you can start to think about within a day or within a week. If I do that 5-mile run on Monday, what does the squat session look like tomorrow? Okay, why is that? Why is it better to do the 5x5 on Monday and do the 20-mile run, the 5-mile run on Tuesday? Okay, and the reason is I just provided a very short synopsis here. Think about the size principle of motor recruitment, okay, of what the individual curves look like. All right, and you can apply this to a mixed model where you're doing. Apply this to a mixed model. And I mean by that is you could be mixing conditioning with lifting. You could be mixing different types of lifting, right? Whatever it may be. These are things to think about. And these are just some general summaries. I left some alternates down here, which we can probably have a long list. But in general, when we think about dynamic training, this is high velocity work. This is getting the type 2 fibers, type 2X fibers that are on board, right? This is where we're trying to be explosive, okay? This type of work, like jumping, doing those light snatches, whatever it may be, is going to have a high magnitude of fitness and fatigue, okay? But it's going to be very short in duration. So in other words, you do your 20-meter sprint, you're tired for just a little bit, and maybe even for the half the day, maybe even the rest of the day to some degree, but then it's gone the next day. Okay. Now again, I'm assuming somebody's fit here. I'm not talking about somebody who's unfit. Okay. You're gonna have a short duration in that type of fatigue, and the fitness gains are also short. So you're gonna have to turn around and sprint again. But this makes sense then if you think about dynamic training. You take smaller bites, higher frequency, and you get better gains out of that than having to do really fatiguing work. Okay. If you look at then the maximal method. You're going to have less magnitude than dynamic in terms of its gains, but longer duration than dynamic. Okay, so you're not going to get that enhancement. Like if you sprint, you can mess with like something like doing which down here I wrote a PAP thing or a PAPE now we're calling it, I guess, where we can enhance dynamic performance within the session. You're not going to see that magnitude and strength, right? Within the session, you're not going to see that improvement. It was like we talked about in the last slide. It's going to take, or when we looked at the article by Chiu and Barnes, it's going to take a little bit longer in order to see that fitness gain. And the reason is because the duration of the fatigue is longer. Okay, so you do your 5x5 training. Again, there's stuff in between here. We can say 3x3 training, but on the speed, whatever. But I'm just saying in general, you did your 5x5 training. You're going to see improvement strength. Okay, but the fatigue is so high, the magnitude of the improvement is not going to be as high as you saw with the dynamic, right? But the fatigue is going to be longer, all right? So what does this look like then? Well, if you lift a heavy thing, if you do 5x5 training and try to do anything dynamic, you're going to be tired. If you lift 5x5 on Monday and you try to do your plyo work on Tuesday, your legs are probably going to be tired, okay? If you do it a few days later, your legs are probably going to be fine. So you probably want to program your dynamic work first in the week and within a session to take advantage of fresh legs. Dynamic training is very sensitive to fatigue. Now, there are different ways to do maximal training. If you did 5x5, not to failure, 2 from fail, right? It's possible then that the fatigue curve, the magnitude of that fatigue curve is going to be lower and the duration of it's going to be lower. Then you'll see fitness produced in a greater amount after just a few days without the fatigue present. Okay, I hope that makes sense. What I'm getting here is you'll see the main driver here is volume. Okay, volume. The more volume you do, the longer the fatigue is going to be. Okay? The more volume you do, the greater the magnitude of fatigue is going to be. Okay? And when you mix in intensity then on top of that, then you're really going to jack up both. All right? So volume is the big driver here. Okay? Volume is the big driver. Volume builds and volume kills. Okay? Repetition then is all about volume. So it has less magnitude than maximal in general, unless you reach extremes or you're trying to overreach. So what would this look like? Let's say you do a 3x10, okay, or a drop set even after or whatever it is. You just got, okay, that's some volume that's going to cause some fatigue maybe the next day. However, a 3x10, right, it's going to last for a while, but the magnitude of that fatigue isn't going to be significant, Okay. So that fatigue might last for 4 days or 3 days potentially. Okay. But again, the magnitude's not, so it's going to take some out of your legs, but not so much that it would destroy every single session afterwards. All right. Especially if you're fit. However, if you did 5x10, yes, now you're going to see the magnitude increase and the duration is going to be high as well. You're going to see that take it out of your rest of your sessions. If we put this in conditioning, if you do a short 15-minute HIIT training, yeah, you're going to have some fatigue the next day. It's not going to be high in magnitude, but it's going to be there. And maybe for the next 2 days, depending how fit you are. But if you did 35 minutes, 40 minutes of HIIT training, okay, like a legit HIIT, you're moving the whole time, it was all conditioning, you're going to see that fatigue amplitude higher, especially the next day, and then you're going to have a longer duration as well. So it could wipe out your squat workout on Wednesday if you did it on Monday. All right. Now, I'm not saying it will. Again, there's a lot of things like how fit you are and so on and so forth, right? You see some of these CrossFitters, that's why they're phenomenal, like some of these high-level CrossFit athletes. They're turning around and recovering quickly. I saw this in the Olympic caliber athletes that I've worked with over the years. That is the number one thing next to their mindset that I saw that was the difference between your average athlete or even a very good athlete, is they could recover quickly. So they can take, and that's what PEDs do, right? Too, is that, it's not so much like people think taking anabolic steroids is about getting super jacked. It's about recovery. Like the faster you can recover, then you can get a better stimulus at a high quality again. And that's why, when we think about fitness fatigue curve, for those that are clean athletes and clean individuals, and again, looking at some of these athletes that are assumed clean, that are doing phenomenal things, you're like, man, how do they recover so fast? Well, it's just, right, God-given talent, that physiology that they can do that. And so, when we're thinking about, applying volume builds and volume kills, this is what I think about. When we think about bodybuilding, is frequency of training better? Yes, at a point it is. And the reason is, if you're taking on, I'm going to use an extreme example here, 30 sets of an exercise or of a movement, let's say a horizontal pressing. If you do 30 sets in one session, which you can, there's so much fatigue that is occurring in that one session now, you could actually be detrimental to hypertrophy. It'd be better to chunk out those sessions, maybe to 2, maybe even 3, right? In order to get quality volume, maintaining the load while you're moving at these moving with high quality volume. You're not getting what's called junk volume, right? You're not doing conditioning work. You're trying to build the musculature. Okay. And so the load isn't so far reduced that you're getting quality pump. You're getting a quality stimulus for hypertrophy. So this is another example, again, thinking about fitness fatigue curve. We can see this applied through many different situations. All right, so the repetition method, longer duration than maximal. It may not be as high in amplitude. If you go for that 1 mile, if you go for that 3-mile run on Monday, your legs are probably going to be a little tired the next day. Are you like debilitated? No, but you probably find that you don't jump as high or lift as much weight as you did when you reverse the order. All right, it's because the duration is higher. Okay, the magnitude is lower, and that's in extreme cases. Okay? Again, you see the effect of volume here. Okay, you see the effect of volume. Maximal and dynamic tend to be set up naturally to be lower in volume. Right now, if you do 30 reps of 80% squats, chunked out in some way, you're going to pick up some fatigue from that. There's no doubt about it. That's going to affect you maybe for the next 72 hours. Okay, depending on who you are and your fitness level. All right, so again, this is where the volume kind of comes in, but dynamic, maximal, and repetition in general kind of separate themselves because of the nature of the work. If I want to do dynamic work well, I know volume is going to be an issue. I got to be really strategic with my volume. I want to be careful not to have any sort of fatigue entering right in the picture if I want to get maximal sprint, right, jump high, those type of things, be as fast as I can into the bar, so on and so forth. If we're talking about maximal, again, it's a blend of the two. I want to be sensitive fatigue. It's not as sensitive fatigue as dynamic. It's going to require some volume in order to see progress because I have to practice the way, and it's going to start to bleed in repetition. As more repetitions, more muscle mass building, right, over time, more technique, whatever it may be. That's going to be required, right? But now I'm going to have a higher magnitude of fatigue and potentially fitness now. Over the long term, but I have to be mindful now that curve is going to have a greater duration, curve of fatigue, and then the repetition method, right? Now, if you think about these long term, the volume over time builds stability, what used to be called stability, Verkhoshansky stability in training, okay? So if you thought about this over the long term, repetition builds fitness that is maybe low in magnitude, but it's long lasting, where like if I did a PAP protocol or PAPE protocol where I lift something heavy, then I jump higher, but only in that moment. Over time, though, if I keep doing, in that session, I might not jump high the next day like I did with that extra stimulus of the maximum method. But over time, if I keep lifting weights and getting stronger, more muscle mass, and I keep practicing jumping and being as fast as I can, the neurological component, I will see, right, my fitness start to stabilize at higher levels. Okay, so there's a lot of ways to think about this. Hopefully I'm not losing you there. So here's the order I already mentioned. In general, dynamic maximal repetition, this could be within a day. It could be within a week. If you have an important dynamic session or this is a part of the time of year, you need to be fast. If you're involved in strength conditioning of some sort, make sure you have your maximal rest days before those dynamic days. Okay, now here's some ways to think about it differently though. Like in powerlifting, you might have your maximal day first, then turn around and do your dynamic day. Okay. There's ways to think of what we're talking about here is people who can do that can recover, that are fit enough to do something like that have a 5x5 training or whatever, or just heavy lifting. It doesn't have to be 5x5, but heavy lifting, and then turn around and come back and do a dynamic day because the fatigue has been eliminated. That's the important piece here, that the individual is able to recover and their fatigue has been eliminated. All right. You could do a repetition maximal style day. Now I'm going to promote the 5x5 type of training that may cause some fatigue, but by Friday, this individual or Saturday is recovered. And so now they can have some maximal expressions of dynamic maximal. So I'm thinking about weightlifting here. You do your 5x5 squat training, you're doing your lifts and snatches, clean and jerk, but then you have max out Friday or max out Saturday, right? Where you're going to see the recovery, because it's been enough time, there's been enough sufficient recovery. There was enough volume pumped in the system, right? 5x5, 25 reps, but not so much that fatigue was so high that by the time you got to the end of the week, you actually saw an enhancement performance. Okay. And this is a weightlifter. So they weren't doing, they weren't jogging during the week either. That would cause fatigue. That would start to mask some of those fitness gains that have been gained through the 5x5 training. So I hope that makes sense. Okay. Again, you can see how complicated this gets in somebody who's trying to do strength conditioning. And I say complicated as you sit down and look at it. You just have to, there's not going to be a perfect way to do this. You're going to have some interference at some point. But this is where a thoughtful, programming should take place, where early on you might be doing a lot of conditioning. Okay. Well, that's going to don't even bother doing jump training or speed training at that point, because if you're going to do conditioning 3 days a week, you have this constant, we call low frequency fatigue. You have this fatigue that's always there, right? Until it's dealt with a deload week or a pullback week or whatever you want to call it. Okay, it's going to be there and it's going to interfere with strength work. It's going to interfere with, take on those 2 weeks and then I'm going to have a deload. Then I'm going to come back in week 4 and start to ramp up strength work and pull back on the volume. That's with conditioning. Conditioning can be done with the barbell, right? I'm going to pull back on the volume a little bit. This is thinking about over the course of weeks now. Okay, and then when I get to, when I get close to my competition or camp or whatever it is, by that time the volume has come down for the most part, and I'm doing just a lot of maintenance stuff with conditioning. I'm doing heavier loads with lower volume with lifting, and so I'm really pulling the fatigue out. Okay, this is a separate. I'll do a video some other time about. I think most sport coaches peak in the wrong time. They're peaking at camp for a lot of these sports, or in practice when they should be peaking at their major part of their season. Okay, and you might lose some games because you have some fatigue levels that are a little higher. You have to be careful with injuries, of course. I'm not talking about kill the athletes in terms of like so high of fatigue, but maybe work harder in the weight room for the first 3 weeks of the season if you have a long season, and then pull the volume down later when the games really matter, right? I think that's a big mistake in strength conditioning for some coaches. I think a lot of strength coaches have realized that, but with this idea we would win every single game. I'm not saying we shouldn't try, but win the important games, right? I mean, there's been teams that have been undefeated or had low loss seasons and then win the championship, and nobody cares. It's about winning championships, right? That's what matters. Win your region, win your district, win your state championship, win your the NCAA regional championship, whatever. Win the NCAAs, right? Right. Peak at the right time. Don't peak at the right side. Anyway, I won't go down the rabbit hole. So I hope this is helpful. Again, the alternatives down here: maximal dynamic, fatigue controlled, can produce better outcomes later, but fatigue is the issue. Remember, volume has to be carefully managed and based on the individual, you, the athlete, whoever you're training. Again, another one could be repetition maximum. I mentioned this before of a coach of a overreach cycle. I'm going to really push hard the volume maximal early, and then I'm going to understand, though, I have to build in a fatigue or a deload period, or I'm going to hurt the athlete. They could actually get hurt if I don't say, okay, I'm going to push hard here for a whole cycle, and then I'm going to give them 2 weeks of deload instead of just my typical 1 or half a week or whatever you do. Okay, if whatever you put in the system, you got to recover in order to see it. And again, I hope you see that with the curve. If you dip deep on the fatigue trough, you're gonna have to have a longer time for recovery. okay, is when we talk about tapering. If you haven't seen that video, take a look. You know, if you're somebody who's just starting out, your fatigue curves are just tiny. Don't worry about tapering. But if you train for a whole year, you have a little bit of fatigue dip potentially from a hard cycle or whatever it is, because your stimulus has to be higher during each cycle. You're going to have a longer taper. If somebody's on a quad in the Olympics and they've been, you know, yeah, they're tapering for worlds and doing all these things, but you know, that last cycle, the stimulus has to be so ridiculously high because these athletes are butted up against their genetic ceiling and their limits, that the fatigue and stimulus are so great that you might have to have a taper that's 10 to 14 days long. All right. Hope that makes sense. Hope you're still with me. If you're watching, like this video, subscribe to my channel. I'm trying to get to 100 subscribers. Check out my other videos on topics, including tapering I've mentioned before, journal club and book reviews. I'm trying to cover a lot of things here. I'm hoping you find this valuable. Check out my Patreon page. If I get more Patreons, you can ask questions at the lowest levels. You can ask questions of me. The more Patreons I get, the more time I can justify doing these videos, which I love doing. And so, you know, support this channel if you like what's going on here. I'll see you in the next one. Sorry, this one's so long.